So, good morning, the two of you in the classroom today. So, the third one, good morning. We will continue on the lecture about mortality today. And we had just started on this topic about infant mortality. I have to emphasize that understanding the trends and determinants of infant mortality is important among demographers and public health researchers and policymakers, because the high incidence of babies dying before reaching age 1, that can affect a lot the overall life expectancy of the population. Of course, is bad for these new generations being born. So understanding what are the causes of high incidence of infant mortality is important for us so we can tackle those issues. And the infant mortality rate is the indicator to measure infant death. So we just get the number of babies that died before reaching age 1 in a specific population, a specific time frame, usually a specific year, and divided by the total number of babies that were born in that same population and time. Multiply by 1,000 because usually these numbers are really small, so just have a little, so we can better understand the result of this indicator. And declining infant mortality is key to population growth. So when countries that experience declines in infant mortality, what we saw right after that, after they reach age 1, the chances of them dying declines a lot, and that generates an increase in population size, right? So that was exactly when we saw in the demographic transition, the drop in mortality. What drove most of that drop in mortality in previous decades and centuries was exactly this huge decline in infant mortality. And actually, some actions to keep reducing infant mortality, they are being developed even now in recent years. So even the oral rehydration therapy, pretty much a mix of water, salt, and sugars, developed by this professor from Harvard School of Public Health, Dr. Richard Crash. It was developed recently and tested in Bangladesh, and it has really huge results on tackling health issues on children. So it treats diarrhea, which is the major cause of death in young children. And of course, in previous decades and previous centuries, advances in how we treat water and investment on implemented sewer systems, and also advancements on simple hygiene, washing hands and having surgeries in a clean space and so on, all that contributed for babies reaching at least 1 year of age, right? But these advancements are being developed even in more recent years as well, okay? The infant mortality rate varies a lot by country. So like in using data from 2015, the world average was around 37 deaths of babies before reaching age 1 for every 1,000 births that happened in the world at that time. And the selected countries in this graph have infant mortality varying from 2.2 in Japan and 117 in Sierra Leone. So really high levels of infant mortality above the world average in African and Asian countries, and in the American continent, South America, Latin America, Central America, and North America, and also in Europe, you see lower levels of infant mortality. So we have improved a lot tackling the issue of babies dying before reaching age 1, but that is still a huge public health concern in several African and Asian countries. And here are the countries listed with the highest and lowest infant mortality rates. Data from 2013. Central African Republic, Congo Democratic Republic, Chad, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Sierra Leone with the highest levels. So Central African Republic here, 116 deaths of babies before reaching age 1 for every 1,000 births in that country in that specific year. And the countries with the lowest levels of infant mortality rates, Iceland, Finland, Japan, Singapore, Estonia, and Sweden, right? So Iceland and Finland, they're only 1.8 deaths on average of children before reaching age 1 for every 1,000 births. And what is interesting about this graph here, and I follow Professor Philip Cohen from University of Maryland on Twitter, and he usually has these really nice graphs, demographic graphs using socioeconomic and demographic indicators. And for an American audience, it's usually good because he kind of tries to put in perspective socioeconomic and demographic indicators of the world in comparison to specific subgroups of the American population. So what he shows here, this is the infant mortality rate in the US in total, right? And that's data from 2018 and 19. So in 2018 and 19, on average, 5.8 babies died before reaching age 1 for every 1,000 babies being born in the country. But that number varied a lot by race, ethnicity within the US. So among Asians, it was only 3.8 deaths of these babies. Non-Hispanic white, 4.7. Hispanic population, 5.1. Pacific Islanders, 7.6. American Indians, 9.2. And African Americans, 11 deaths of babies before reaching age 1 for every 1,000 births. So this is just to show that there is a lot of variation in terms of infant mortality by race, ethnicity in the US. But then he goes further in this graph and put the infant mortality rates for other countries as a whole, right? So the level of infant mortality among African Americans in the US is around the same level of Mexico and Brazil, and actually higher than in Turkey, for example. American Indians close to Turkey, Pacific Islanders close to Costa Rica, Hispanics close to Russia, Slovak Republic, and Canada, and kind of like the same as the white population here in the US. And Asians closer to a series of Western European countries and even Eastern European countries as well. But, oh, and another thing that we also see in this graph is that Hispanics and whites, the level of infant mortality among them is kind of like really close, right, to each other, 5.1 and 4.7. And that's related to the Hispanic paradox that we talked about in the last class. The overall, on average, the overall Hispanic population in the US has lower socioeconomic status than the white population, but their health outcomes are at the same level or better than those of the white population. In this case here, it's a little worse, 5.1 deaths compared to 4.7 deaths, but close, really close, or they're at least closer to the infant mortality rate of the white population compared to these other subgroups in the US. But this is just to show that in the US, by race ethnicity, we have these different realities going on. And these are people living around the same areas, the same cities, the same states, right? The same locations, maybe of course in different neighborhoods, but these are people with different life conditions and different socioeconomic status by race ethnicity living in the same space, okay? And here we have infant mortality rates by mother's race ethnicity. And here in the US, varying from 2000 to 2010. And this is the graph that we have in the course textbook. And we see, this is the race ethnicity of the mother. Among women who are non-Hispanic Black, the rates of infant mortality are higher, are the highest one in the country, broken down by race ethnicity. This is the average total, so it's around 7 deaths per 1,000. And here we have around 13. And of course, declining over time. Non-Hispanic white and Hispanics around the same level, which is the same result that we see in Philip Cohen's graph that we saw before. What we see is that the levels of infant mortality rates among non-Hispanic, of children of non-Hispanic Black women are at the highest level. But it has been declining these previous years, dropping a little below 12, which is exactly the same, around the same number that we see here, 11, right? So this number here reaching levels below 12 in more recent years. And here we are going only up to 2010. This data here is from 2018 and 19. When you are in this really high level, either in this indicator here, it's in a bad way, right? High level of mortality. In order to improve it, whenever you have improved, it drops faster than what you see to other groups that already improved a lot. And if you think about the opposite way, that usually applies in the same way for indicators. So if you think about gross domestic product, the gross domestic product of countries that already produce a lot, they are much far ahead, and high numbers in this case is a good thing. They improve over time, but their level of improvement is slower than the level of improvement of countries that are in the bottom here, right? But overall, we see this different level of infant mortality by race ethnicity, and also the differentials being less wide compared to previous years, but it's still a lot of difference there going on. So it shows that we have different opportunities, access to health services and socioeconomic status and education attainment. All of that is tied into infant mortality rate. And it varies by race ethnicity, right? That's kind of like the final outcome of a series of factors that influence mortality. Whenever we are talking about infant mortality, do you remember the life table, right? The life table, in one of the columns there, we had that term AXN. Is the average number of years that people live within each one of the age groups among those people that die within the age group. And for older age groups, starting on the ages 5 to 9 until the older ones, we usually assume that people who die within that age group, they live, the chances of them dying within that age group is the same. Between 5 to 9, the chance of dying there is going to be the same on ages 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those people dying in the age group of 40 to 44, we assume that those dying within that age group will die with the same chances in the ages of 40, 41, 42, 43, 44. But for infant mortality, that's not the case. In the first age group, 0 to 1 and 1 to 4, those babies and children who die in those first two age groups, they die closer to age 1 in the age group of 1 to 4 and closer to age 0 in the age group from 0 to 1, right? And that's related exactly to neonatal and post-neonatal mortality rates. What we are pretty much doing here with these two new indicators is subdividing the infant mortality in two rates. The neonatal mortality rate are deaths of babies aged 20 days or babies dying before reaching 29 days of life. So they are dying at ages of 20 days or less per 1,000 live births. And post-neonatal mortality rate are deaths of babies aged between 29 days and 1 year. And as we saw in the life table, in the first age group of 0 to 1, we implement a formula to calculate life expectancy in a way that those dying between ages 0 to 1, if they die there, they will die closer to age 0. So the mortality will be higher on neonatal mortality rate compared to post-neonatal mortality rate. And this is just an example of neonatal mortality rates and also the overall numbers of deaths of babies before they reach the age of 29 days by regions of the world. So you see from 1990 to 2013, overall the numbers decline, right? So in the world, it declined from 33 deaths of babies before reaching age of 29 days, or over 1,000 births, declined from 33 to 20, so a decline of 40%. And that we see in all over the world, this decline, but it's still, you see a lot of variation in the levels of neonatal mortality rates around the world, really high levels, for example, in Southern Asia, or Southern Asia excluding India, pretty much the same level, Southeast Asia, Oceania even, which includes Australia and New Zealand, but there are other countries around them as well. Sub-Saharan Africa, the highest level, 31, but dropping from 46 and Southern Asia was 51 and dropped to 30. So these are the rates, right? Comparing to the amount of babies that are born in those specific areas of the country. And here we have the overall numbers. So we had 4.6 million deaths of babies in the world in 1990 before they reach age of 29 days, and 2.7 million. So it dropped a lot in absolute numbers, right? 2.7 million dying before reaching the age of 29 days, based on data from 2013. And then you see also the absolute numbers, how they are still big in specific areas of the world. So if you think, for example, that, Sub-Saharan Africa dropped from 46 to 31 deaths for every 1,000 live births. Even with this improve, it declined in proportional terms. But actually, the overall number of babies dying before reaching the age of 29 days increased from 977,000 to close to 1.1 million in 2013. So this is just to show that although we might be have declining rates, since population has been increasing, people then have more kids, the chances of them dying at really young ages is still high. So the overall number of those babies dying is still a really high number of babies. And in Southern Asia too, it declined from almost 2 million to 1.1, but 1.1 is still a really large number of babies being born at really young ages. What are the causes of death when we are talking about babies dying in such young ages? And we usually classify these causes of death of infants as endogenous or exogenous causes. Endogenous causes of death in an infant can happen because of genetic issues or conditions associated with fetal development or the birth process. So it's usually more related to the genetic issues, right? Or really the development of the baby from fetus into a live being. Exogenous causes is due mainly to environmental external factors, such as infections or accidents. So the place where women live, the place where they're having birth, the exposure to infections, the possibility of having accidents, the access to medications during birth, prenatal care, and after birth, those are exogenous conditions outside of the body that influence the health of the babies. And what are the main causes of specific neonatal deaths? The main causes are endogenous causes: congenital malformations, chromosomal abnormalities, complications of delivery, low birth rate, genetic disorders. So endogenous conditions more related to genetic causes. Endogenous causes dominate infant mortality mainly in the early days of life and not for the entire first month of life. All right, so we are talking here about neonatal deaths, neonatal infant mortality. Neonatal infant mortality are those babies dying up to the age of 28 days. Even within those 28 days, the babies that die within those 28 days, the ones that die closer to birth, most of the conditions are endogenous. But those that die later on, closer to 28 days, the chances of dying because of endogenous conditions is still high, but not as high as in the first few days after birth, okay? What about the causes of postneonatal deaths? Postneonatal mortality rate was 18 per 1,000 live births for the world in 2013. So let's just go back to the table before. The neonatal here in 2013 in the world, 20. Let's go back there. Remember, neonatal up to dying up to the age of 28 days. Post-neonatal, 29 days up to a year. So much longer period of time is covered here in post-neonatal mortality rate. But the neonatal mortality rate only in these first few weeks after birth, in the first month, first 4 weeks, in 2013, the rate was 20 per 1,000 live births. And in this wider interval of time from 29 days of age to 1 year, before reaching 1 year, 18, all right, lower post-neonatal mortality rate than neonatal mortality rate, even though post-neonatal, we have a wider time frame. And that's, again, related to that. That's why in the life tables, we have that assumption. In the life table, we have the assumption that the babies dying between ages 0 and 1, when they die closer to 0. And they die closer to 0. What's the intensity? It's dictated, as we did in the life table, by the infant mortality rate. The higher is the infant mortality rate. Chances of dying closer to age 0 is higher compared to the chance of dying closer to age 1, okay? But just to give you an idea of the variation, in developed countries, the post-neonatal mortality rate was only 2 deaths for every 1,000 live births. And in this case, the deaths in post-neonatal, in the post-neonatal period, and in the first few years of life are mainly related to exogenous causes, to the world around us, infectious disease, accidents, injuries, lack of health services, and so on, okay? Improved life standards, better health care, and public health programs have greater effects on these exogenous causes than on the endogenous genetic causes, okay? And here it's important to also look at some other indicators that we have on mortality related to birth and to babies. And one of them is the stillbirth rate, here symbolized by SBR. Stillbirths also are called miscarriages or fetal deaths. A stillbirth is a fetus not born alive and is not registered as a death. So we still don't have a human being there, right? The stillbirth rate is the number of stillbirths per 1,000 live births plus the stillbirths in the year. So the denominator, we add something else. The numerator, we have stillbirths. The denominator, we have the same number of live births, but we add the stillbirths here as well, because this population here of live births and the stillbirths, the idea is that they would be, they would have the chance of experience the event being estimated, measured in the numerator. So the denominator is different than infant mortality rate than the postneonatal and neonatal mortality rate. And stillbirths are often identified in hospital reports dealing with obstetric procedures. So here we don't have actually a baby. It's still a fetus. It's not human being yet. So it's really important to make these distinctions. And the World Health Organization mentions that interventions can be planned if we know at what point before birth the fetus died. And still we have a lot of stillbirths, miscarriages, and fetal deaths going on in the world. Around 2.6 million stillbirths in the world were measured in 2009. And this overall number here gives a rate of 18.9 stillbirths for 1,000 live births plus stillbirths, because this is our denominator, live births plus stillbirths. Right, so it's still a large amount of cases, 2.6 million. Why is it happening? Is it because more related to the genetic causes of women, or is it because women are not having enough food during their pregnancy? They didn't, or is it happening more in countries where like a higher proportion of women are smoking, or because their food that they consume is not good enough? So all the factors, it's important to understand all these factors to implement interventions to tackle this issue, okay? The perinatal mortality rate relates to stillbirths and deaths of babies who live for only 7 days or less. And the denominator is the same as before, live births plus stillbirths. In the same way, we multiply by 1,000. And usually endogenous causes of mortality in the first week after birth are similar to the causes of stillbirth. All right, so the reason of, in that case, already babies, right? Babies being born, human beings there being born and dying before reaching 7 days of age, the reasons of them dying is really related to the same reasons that we have fetal deaths, that we have miscarriages measured by stillbirths. So the perinatal mortality rate in 2010 in the world was 47. So we had 47 stillbirths or deaths of babies before reaching age of 7 days for every 1,000 live births plus stillbirths in the year. It varied a lot. Developed world much lower levels, 10 every 1,000, and less developed world, 50. So it was a really wide margin there. And Czech Republic and Singapore around 4, and Mauritania around 111. So some countries really with really high levels. And in the US, actually lower than the average of the developed countries. And because it's such a low level right now, it's hard to kind of like go even lower, but seeing some improvements in this last year, 6.5 to 6.3. But infant mortality rate in the US and maternal mortality rate in the US is still an issue. And like we saw in the previous graphs, the one by Dr. Cohen, it varies a lot by race, ethnicity, right? And I just mentioned maternal mortality. Maternal mortality, the indicator that we use is not a rate, it's a ratio. So that's the maternal mortality ratio. Maternal mortality ratio measures the extent to which mothers die immediately before, during, or after giving birth because of problems associated with the pregnancy or childbirth. Why is it called a ratio and not a rate? The numerator, what is the numerator? Number of deaths in a year of women So the numerator is women dying as a result of complications of pregnancy, childbirth, and the puerperium, the condition of the woman immediately following childbirth. And what is the denominator in that indicator? Live births happening in the year. So the numerator is number of women dying because of complications related to the pregnancy or childbirth. In the denominator are live births. So here we have the babies, the denominator. Numerator, we have the mothers dying because of these problems. So the denominator is not the population that has the risk of experiencing the event being measured in the numerator. What we have here is a population of women dying for these issues. And in the denominator, we have this population of live births. We are comparing the number of women to the number of live births of babies. Two different populations. We are kind of comparing the size of these women dying for these issues during pregnancy and childbirth to the number of live births. So since we have two different populations, we have a ratio, not a rate. Okay? The same thing about the dependency ratio. If you talk about the total dependency ratio, we get the number of children and older people divided by the number of people in working ages. These are different people, ratio. Sex ratio, number of men divided by the number of women, different people. So that's ratio. The denominator, it's not those people with the chance of experiencing the event in the numerator. So that's important. And some people, when they mention maternal mortality using this indicator, they say maternal mortality ratio, maternal mortality rate, and that's not appropriate. The correct term is maternal mortality ratio because of the way that's estimated. Since the level of maternal mortality ratio is so low nowadays, it is usually multiplied by 100,000 because of being really rare in developed countries. But in the US, there are several researchers now pointing out of an increase in maternal mortality ratios in the US and really associated with race ethnicity, right? So African-American women die more because of problems during pregnancy or childbirth, exactly related to issues that they experience in prenatal care and less access to health services and so on, and also the conditions in which they have birth, right? Because of health services being so expensive in the US, that affects health of people. And that affects specific subgroups with higher chances. Some examples of maternal death in the US or in the world as a whole: 529,000 maternal deaths in 2000. That number declined to 313,000. So that's a good thing, because we also know the population in 2015 was higher than in 2000. And in the developing regions in 2015, it concentrated 99% of all maternal deaths. For all these maternal deaths here, 313,000 in 2015, 99% of them happened in developing regions. 66% of them happened in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 21% of them happened in Southern Asia. So 87% of these deaths here of women because of issues during pregnancy or childbirth happen in Sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Asia. In the world, now talking about the ratio, maternal mortality ratio, we had 216 deaths of women per 100,000 live births, and also a lot of variation. Sierra Leone, 1,360 deaths per 100,000 live births. Sub-Saharan Africa, 546. In the US, Iran, and Hungary, around 21. Greece, Singapore, around 3, and Estonia, around 2. Much lower levels in those countries, right? What are the factors associated with maternal mortality ratio? Maternal deaths are mostly due to age, parity, and birth spacing. So younger and older women are more likely to die because of issues related to pregnancy and childbirth compared to women between the ages of 20 and in their 30s up to 39, 40 years of age. Women that have more children, so higher priority, those women that already had more children and they have even further children in their life, they will be more likely to die because of issues due to pregnancy and childbirth. So high fertility for women, it's actually detrimental to their health. Women with short birth spacing are also at high risk. Women that have children close in age are also more likely to die because of issues related to pregnancy and childbirth, exactly because having a baby affects so much women's body that having that in a short period of time over and over will increase their chance of dying because of pregnancy or issues during childbirth. Some other factors: chronic disease and malnutrition, poverty, unwanted pregnancies, inadequate prenatal and obstetric care, and lack of access to a hospital. So I said, we still have a lot of high maternal mortality ratio among African-American women compared to other subgroups. And that's related to a series of issues that they experience in their life. They don't have access to adequate prenatal care, lower levels of socioeconomic status, and so on. And this topic here, I completely understand that in Texas, for example, or here around this university, people take it as a more religious subject. Unwanted pregnancies is a huge concern for maternal death. So whenever we are talking about decriminalizing abortion and allowing women to get an abortion because that relates to their health, to their desires, to what they want for themselves, is because that can affect, that will have a negative effect on the chances of them surviving, and will affect the lives of their children afterwards if they have an unwanted pregnancy. Right? So when we talk about abortion in demography and public health, we are not talking about morals, we are not talking about religion, we are talking about public health. We are talking about women pretty much being forced to have children that they don't want it, and that can affect their chances, that can affect their chance of dying, and will affect the livelihood of their babies. And the other thing is they don't, no woman is like, oh, I want to have abortion in my life. It's not a thing that anybody envisions. That's a huge decision for every woman who decides to do that. But having the option to do it in an extreme case, or in the case that they really don't want to have it, a baby, it's a matter of public health. It's not a matter of religion, right? And if I don't follow some religious beliefs, why may I not decide to don't have a baby, right? So that would be the case of many women. Cool? So that topic, it's really contentions here in more conservative states and conservative areas like Texas A&M, but it's important for us to debate it in a more public health approach because that's affecting people's lives. This last topic that's discussed in the textbook on this chapter about mortality is about what we expect the trends of mortality to happen in the next years, in the next decades. Is it likely that mortality rates will continue to fall, resulting in higher levels of life expectancy than those attained by developed countries? So should we expect the world to keep improving mortality? In other words, mortality declining and people living longer, even longer than the indicators that we have right now? And there are usually two different groups of demographers there. One that argues that there is a limit of how much we can improve life expectancy, and the other one that argues against one, that we actually can think of human beings on average live longer and longer as we develop. And the author of the textbook, Dudley Poston, argues against a fixed biological maximum life expectancy. So he argues against one. He has a more optimistic view on this subject. And we have seen some mortality reversals in the world, right? Modern medical and public health techniques will surely bring about further reductions in mortality from the major causes. So we should expect to have still improvements in life expectancy. However, there is evidence since the early 1980s of mortality reversals, both in Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. So specifically in Eastern Europe, what is causing the mortality reversals? Past possible causes, as explained in the textbook, are lack of preventive health programs, inadequate quality of medical services, smoking, alcohol abuse, general neglect of individual health. And these were caused by lack of life choices under the former communist regimes, and also because of the changes that people experienced during the new capitalist regime: unemployment, relative deprivation, and inability to cope with these new economic challenges. So both all the reality that they had before and after, like during communism, during capitalism, is affecting their mortality, their life being, and that increases mortality in these countries and affects in a negative way life expectancy. What about the subject of Sub-Saharan Africa? The AIDS epidemic has halted or reversed gains in life expectancy in many of the Sub-Saharan African countries. And so here we have, and this is related to a graph that I showed early on in this lecture of how we still have really high incidence of people infected with the HIV virus, and then a higher possibility of them dying because of AIDS, because of not having adequate medications, right? So degenerative diseases are the major causes of death in the developed world right now. Future improvements in the treatment of these diseases is likely to happen. However, what we have to think is like eliminating a specific degenerative disease would result in really small increases in life expectancy, because these diseases already occur among older people. So if you kind of like tackle the issue of causes of death that are usually concentrated among older people, of course, that's great. But in terms of life expectancy, you're not going to see a huge improvement there. For example, eliminating heart disease would raise life expectancy in the US by 5 years, and eliminating cancer would raise it by 3 years. Okay, it's 3 additional years of life is good, 5 years additional years of life is good, but it's just to show that whenever we tackle this cause of deaths that happen more around older ages, we don't gain as much life expectancy as a whole. An important question that the author highlights in the textbook is not, will life expectancy increase? The important question is, by how much will life expectancy increase, according to the data that we have right now? And because of the pandemic, that became a huge topic of debate, because we were all concerned about degenerative diseases, all right? Because that's where the major chances of people dying are. But now we have the pandemic going on, and with all these deaths related to COVID-19, to infectious disease, not degenerative disease, a communicable disease. And then we see some countries having really strong negative effects on their life expectancy. I already show you data here in this course, like the CDC estimating a decline in life expectancy in the country between 2020 and 2021 of 1.5 years of life. And researchers from the Max Planck Institute in Rostock, Germany, of 2. years of life expectancy decline between 2020 and 2021. So somewhere between that, 1.5 and 2. The US was increasing fertility, life expectancy, and then in these last years, decline a lot compared to the increases that we saw, all right? So development is not a straightforward thing. We have a series of cycles that go on in our society, and this is something that we're experiencing right now, right? And that's why after the start of the pandemic, I keep going back into these data sources to get information about it. So back in the fall 2020, when I started teaching, I mean, I taught this class even before the fall 2020, but when I taught this class on fall 2020, I got the number of deaths for the top 20 countries in the world in terms of deaths related to the coronavirus pandemic. So here, this table is ordered by the number of total deaths. In the US, 181 in August 2020. So we have here number of cases, deaths, total recovered, active cases, serious critical. And here we have the total number of cases divided by the population, multiplied by the 1 million. Deaths divided by the population, multiplied by 1 million. We have the death rates. Total tests divided by population, multiplied by 1 million, we have here, okay? So 181,000, 115,000 in Brazil. And then in the following semester, January 2021, it increased from 181,000 in the US to 408,000. And then in August, the following semester, beginning of the next semester, it increased from 408 to 656. January 2020, 874, 2022. And then reaching almost more than 1 million now in these last few weeks. I mean, so it's just, and I showed it to you in the last class. This is the table for the beginning of this semester, January 2022, 870. And now 874. And now, just a few weeks before the class now, 1,004,000 deaths. So this is just to show that we still had, just within these few months that we started this course, 130,000 deaths related to the pandemic. Just to show that the problem is still there, right? And we also mentioned that 28% of the eligible population in the US that could get vaccinated is not vaccinated. So that's a huge issue. And still 130,000 people died between January and March this year. So here, number of cases. When we see this number of cases, we would get scared because we see these waves of high incidence of cases, and we see, wow, really high incidence of cases now with the Omicron variant at the beginning of this year. But then it did not translate into so high levels of mortality in the second graph. You see here this wave lower than this one and higher incidence of deaths, right? If you put these two graphs together, you see here in the first little wave, you had a lot of deaths comparing to number of deaths to cases. And in this case here, the previous two graphs, we have the overall numbers of people dying, of people having coronavirus. And here, the number of people dying because of the disease. And here we already have rates. And then in this wave, number of cases translating in deaths. This wave, deaths. This much steeper wave, we also had an increase in deaths. But why we didn't see an even steeper increase in deaths here, as we saw, for example, in this case? Because now we have more people vaccinated. People vaccinated still can get sick, but not sick enough to die, right? So the chances of dying are much smaller. So that shows the importance of getting vaccinated. And this is data from now, from this year, the beginning of the year. okay? And this is something that I showed. The data that I showed in the last class was I went to this website here, and we had the data for April. This one, I just got it now, and it's pretty much the same thing. Around 66% of the American population is vaccinated. But then we have to be careful, right? What is the denominator here? Is the total population in the country. In the US, the vaccines are available at this point only for people who are at least 5 years old. So for children between the ages of 0 and 4, they are not still eligible to get the vaccine. 0 to 4, as we saw, we have around 6% of the American population in the ages of 0 to 4, including boys and girls. 6% plus 66, 72% of the population. So we have 28% of the population eligible to get vaccinated, but not vaccinated. So that's why we still have people dying because of this virus, okay? And here it's, again, data from the same professor, Philip Coleman from University of Maryland. And he just shows here, he mixes a bunch of different variables, demographic characteristics of people. And this is data from 2021, from September 1st to September 13. But it's just to have an idea of what are the categories, the characteristics of people that have been experiencing the highest levels of vaccination. So exactly people that are more better off, with people with higher socioeconomic status are more likely to get vaccinated, around 90% of them. Oh, is it because they can pay for the vaccines? No, the vaccines are free, right? But that's because they know the vaccines are important. And when we go to university and we get a bachelor's degree, we start to know how science is important. We have a bachelor's degree. Yeah, almost also 90% of people with a bachelor's degree are vaccinated. Non-Hispanic Asian population, really high levels, around 87% of them. And then you start to see different subcategories of the population, but then you see people with less than high school, with the lowest level of vaccination, around 62, active duty military, around 65, and that's kind of sad because a lot of they are serving, are exposing themselves to all these different environments, and they're choosing to don't get vaccinated. People with like low earnings, also lower chance of getting vaccinated. And younger people, right? Again, people with younger people, low educated people, and people with low earnings are the ones choosing to don't be vaccinated. All these people here could be vaccinated at this point, okay? The likelihood of getting the COVID-19 vaccine by education. This is not whether the people are vaccinated or not. They're asked like, what is the likelihood that you would be vaccinated? So this percentage here, and this is data from January 2021 and February 2021. So it was at the beginning of the time that we were getting vaccines available, right? The beginning of last year. So at that time, only 16% of the people with college degree and only 8% of people with no college degree were vaccinated here in the US. Because vaccines were just coming out. But then we asked into everybody in this survey, what's your likelihood if you're not vaccinated, if you're not here, of getting vaccine? Really likely, unlikely, unsure, by college degree. Those with college degree, 60% of them more likely, 45% only likely to get vaccinated, and 34% unlikely among non-college degree, and 20% unlikely to get vaccinated if they have a college degree. And this is related to this previous graph, that later on in September 2021, those with a bachelor's degree, higher percentages of them fully vaccinated, and those with lower education, lower percentage of them fully vaccinated, okay? So this graph here comes before January to February 2021, and this one here, September 2021. And as I have been emphasizing, socioeconomic and demographic indicators, they vary a lot by race, ethnicity in this country related to historical reasons, to racism, to access to healthcare, and so on in their country. And we see that when we look at COVID deaths per 100,000 population. So here we have death rates related to the pandemic. It increases with age. So these bars here with different colors, we have the age groups. So people who are older are more likely to die. And this is data from September 30th. I think that's 2021. That's September 30th, 2021. Older people more likely to die. I should put the years here in these slides, but that's September 30, 2021. And the denominator, information from the 2018 American Community Survey. For all race ethnicity groups, as people get older, more likely to die because of the COVID-19. But also you look for maintain constant each one of the age groups, the chance of dying are higher among African Americans compared to white, Asians, Hispanics, right? Even for the group between 75 and 84 years of age, higher than among Hispanics, close, but higher and much higher compared to Asians and whites. Close to Hispanics around the ages of 65 and 74, but much higher compared to Asians and whites, okay? So still, even with this new thing going on, how our society is organized in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of opportunities for people, in terms of access to healthcare, that affects the likelihood of people dying because of the pandemic. One major argument from the previous administration, from the Trump administration at the beginning, was that, oh, as many deaths happen because of the flu every year, and we are all concerned about the deaths related to COVID-19. And this is data that I pretty much just took it from CDC, the number of deaths, the annual number of deaths related to flu between 2010 and 2020. And here are the deaths related to COVID-19 in the US only in the year of 2020. That's why here it's not the 1 million that I showed before that we reached right now. It's only, or a lot already, but 351,000, right? 351,000, I don't know. I'm not that good with math, but I think it's higher than 22,000, right? A little bit higher. So if we just look at the data, we kind of like make the counter argument of all these people that were saying that the pandemic was not important and failed to act as policymakers, right? So it's really easy to lie about these public health issues and overall issues that the society is facing. But if you look at the data, which is the correct way to do it, you see that the problem is serious. And here, the percentage of people teleworking, and this is based on data from August 2021, because of the pandemic, again, showing disparities in the country, right? Because we know that people with better education, they have higher earnings. They already have higher earnings. And they are usually in occupations that allow them to work from home. They don't have to go in person to their work. And exactly those people with lower levels of education are in jobs in which they cannot telework. They have to go in person. So the percentage of them being able to work from home during the pandemic of those with high school and less than high school was really small compared to those with a graduate degree or bachelor degree, okay? And this is also remote work in the pandemic. And this is data from the early 2020 until the end of 2021. And we see that those in management and professional positions, which usually, again, have higher earnings, were the ones more likely to work, to telework, to work from home because of the pandemic. The ones in sales and offices, a little lower, like around 35% at the beginning of this period, and services even lower. So exactly those people that are more exposed to the chance of getting sick because they have to go to work and we interact with a lot of people, they are the ones less likely to work from home. But of course, this percentage has been declining throughout all these months, okay? It's just to show that people that already have a better socioeconomic status, better occupation, better education, they also have a life situation that allow them to be less exposed to the chance of contracting the virus. Cool? Here, the same idea. Percentage of people able to telework in specific occupations and the average hourly wage. So restaurant workers are the group on average that have the lowest wages in the country. And they are the ones less likely to be able to work from home because they work in the restaurant industry. So exactly those with already low earnings also are more likely to expose themselves and get sick because of the virus, of COVID-19 virus. And where's he mentions here the percent of, and the size of the bubbles here are pretty much the number of people in each one of these occupations, just to see that we have a lot of people in these occupations here making really low earnings, low average hourly wage, around $13 per hour, and really likely to have to work in person. And people in better paid occupations, more likely to work from home, okay? And here I just put like some websites where I collect data. This, for example, is the one that I use a lot here was the Worldometers, Our World in Data. I use this a lot here. I also got data from the New York Times. But for most of the graphs that I showed here were from these two, and also from Philip Cohen, the professor from University of Maryland. Some other resources that we can get already studies done about the coronavirus and demography, the variation of coronavirus by sex, and also how coronavirus has been tackled in different ways related to the ideological background of governments, okay? Cool. So I think we still have a lot of time here. So I will continue and start on the chapter about internal migration. This chapter here, we're gonna first give an introduction and introduce concepts, definitions, and measures of migration. I talk about the major concepts and ways to measure migration. And then afterwards, I will show some examples of the trends in internal migration in the US. And this, I show you some graphs here, some maps here to show the areas within the US that are more likely to receive internal migrants, people moving within the US, broken down by nativity, whether they are foreign born, US born, and also broken down by race ethnicity. And this subtopic here is not in the textbook. That's something that I added here from my own research project. This part here about internal migration in China, it is in the textbook. It is at the end of this lecture, but I will not cover. So I will just leave here as extra reading, and it's not gonna be covered in our final exam, right? So the final exam for this specific chapter here, it's gonna cover only this 5 first subtopics. So besides fertility and mortality, the third way that population size can change is through migration. Not only the size of the population, but also the composition of the population, because usually people are more likely to migrate when they are between 20 and 35 years of age. So if a country receives a lot of migrants, they would tend to have all these people in labor ages moving to their places, and the same thing applies to internal migration. The size of the population decreases in the area of origin and increases in the area of the destination. Unlike fertility and mortality, the event of migration may occur on multiple occasions or never happen during our lifetime. Of course, mortality, it will happen and will happen just once, right? So that's how it is. You could make the counter argument from this statement in the textbook by saying, oh, fertility also can happen several times and also vary by population. And nowadays, as we saw in the previous chapters, more women we have a higher percentage of women decided to don't have children at all. So to don't have the fertility equals to 0. So in that case, you could say that fertility also have these possibilities of happening multiple times or not happening at all in someone's lifetime. I go back here to the definition of migration that was developed by Lee in 1966. I mean, I just like to go back to these original studies, as I did before when I talk about Todaro, when he wrote those books at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s about urbanization, because it kind of shows that all this understanding that we have right now about internal migration, of course, we learn something new every day, but a lot of the framework was already debated decades ago. So migration is defined broadly as a permanent or semi-permanent change of residency. There is no restriction is placed upon the distance of the move or upon the voluntary or involuntary nature of the act. And there is a difference here between this definition of Lee and the definition that the US Census Bureau uses. The definition that the US Census Bureau uses is that people are migrants if they move from internal migrants, if they move from one county to the other, and if they have lived there for at least 1 year. So the US Census Bureau uses this standard. People live at least 1 year in this county, and they came from another county within the US, they are internal migrants, okay? And so it's just important whenever if I ask you the question, what's the general definition of internal migrants by the US Census Bureau? They live in a specific county for at least 1 year, and they moved from another county before. And, but for example, the Census Bureau, with the restricted data that we have available, such as in the Texas Research Data Center, located here at Texas A&M, we actually can estimate moves of people even between census tracts. But those are not actually considered internal migration per this definition of the US Census Bureau, but they can bring us some interesting patterns because we can understand migration within counties. And if I'm a policymaker trying to understand what's going to be the demand for schools within my community, I might be interested on seeing people moving within my city from one school district to the other, because then I would have an idea to project the population of, are people moving more here, more there? We will have to build a new school. There's something going on in College Station right now. It's good for these policymakers to know where people are moving to each school district, and if they will have to break the school district, build more schools, and so on. So although the US Census Bureau used that definition, we can go to finer geographical scales. But what Lee is mentioning is that people move and change their lives, and that move can be in short distances or long distances. When he mentions that there is no distinction made between external and internal migration, is that both people moving within countries, internal migrants, and between countries, international migrants, they are all migrants. So all of them are part of the subtopic of demography called migration, right? Every act of migration involves an origin, a destination, and a series of intervening obstacles. Distance is always present as an intervening obstacle, like the distance from one place to the other. If one city is closer to me, I will be more likely to move to that one in relation to a farther away city. But not just distance. Like, for example, moving from Cuba to Miami, distance is really short, but because of the embargo, because of all this history that we have, the migration is not so common as you would expect for regions being so close to each other, right? So there are a series of other intervening obstacles, not just distance. So what's the definition of migration? It's a permanent change of residence. So it's a residential mobility, moving a great enough distance that all activities are transferred from one place to the other. So people commuting from the place where they live in one day, going to work in another city and then coming back, that's not considered migration. These are movers, but they're not migrants. So I live in College Station, go during the day to work in Houston, another city, and come back. I'm not a migrant. I'm commuting. I'm just moving from College Station to Houston, but all my household, everything is still here located in College Station in this example. International migrants, they move between countries, either legally or without documents, and internal migrants move within national boundaries, usually without constraint. But the whole subtopic of this chapter related to China, about internal migration in China, shows that people to be able to move from rural to urban areas, they have to get an approval from the government. If they don't get that approval, that permit, people keep moving even without the approval, but then they won't be able to access the education system for their children, health resources for free. So everything's going to be more difficult. They will not be able to get formal jobs, which are the more better paid. And what they do usually, they move by themselves and leave their families back in their place of origin in the rural areas where their children will have access to health and education system, right? So internal migration, when we look here in the US, of course, I can move to wherever place I go. I'm more likely to move to one place to the other if I have connections and so on, depending on my education, my earnings, but there is not a law against it, okay? How do we measure migration? Permanence usually means that you have been gone at least 1 year from the old place. So that's what I just said. The standard in the US Census Bureau should say that I'm a migrant when I move from a previous place to this place, and I live here for at least 1 year. What about the distance moved? In the US, the Census Bureau defines a migrant as a person who has moved to a different county within the US. So the person moves from another county and lives in the new one for at least a year. But I mentioned, from the standpoint of a local school district, a migrant would be someone moving into or out of the school district's boundaries. So as a policymaker, maybe dealing with the demand for schools in specific school districts, I would want to see the rates of people moving in finer areas than finer geographical areas than counties. I would like to see data of people moving to specific school districts, to areas within the city, right, to better plan what we have to do to the city in the next years, in the next decades. And what is the migration transition? Something that we already talked here before. So it's the permanent movement of people from one place to the other, usually in response to resources scarcity in the area of origin, typically caused by population growth and not enough resources for them. And then people move to another area. And they move to this other area where they have information that it has enough resources. It's my perceived knowledge about it. It's my limited knowledge. I know that I live in a rural area. The population is not so big, but big enough for the resources that we have. And as far as I know, the urban area has better resources. So the migration transition, internal migration transition, is closely related to the urban transition because most migrants are moving from rural areas to urban areas. And more nowadays, we have people moving from urban areas to other urban areas. So we have what is called the migration evolution, right? But it's already 12:25. I will continue on the lecture about internal migration next week on Tuesday. The quiz is open now on Canvas. And we pretty much just have 2 more weeks of class, 4 more days, and then the final exam. Okay, so I will try to cover as much as I can in these 4 lectures, the topics of internal migration and international migration. Okay, thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday.